It's December 1942. The report arrived in Berlin through the usual gray channels, coded messages, intercepted chatter, and a whisper passed between officers who no longer knew what to believe. The document was brief, precise, and unbelievable. It claimed that Ford's massive plant in Michigan had reached a level of efficiency that defied logic. One armored vehicle rolling off the assembly line every few minutes. 500 tanks in a single day. To the men of the German High Command, it sounded like an American fairy tale wrapped in propaganda. They laughed, exchanged doubtful glances, and tossed the papers aside. But when the report finally reached Hitler's desk, the laughter faded. He read it twice, then a third time. His pale hand tapped the table, restless. "Impossible," he muttered. No factory could produce war machines at that pace. Germany's best facilities, running day and night, could barely reach a fraction of those numbers. Yet the report came not from Allied sources, but from his own intelligence network. He ordered another verification. The answer came back the same. Ford's plant was not a rumor. It was a fortress of steel and motion, a machine that turned men and metal into power. For a moment, silence filled the room. The idea that civilians, ordinary workers, engineers, even women, could outbuild the Reich's industrial might was more than insulting. It was terrifying. Germany's strength had always been measured by its discipline, precision, and will. But what if America's power came from something simpler? The rhythm of machines that never stopped. Across the Atlantic, in the vast expanse of Detroit, the air trembled with the sound of production. Sparks flew like fireflies, conveyor belts clattered, and the smell of oil and metal filled the night. The Ford River Rouge plant, once a temple of automobiles, had transformed into an arsenal. Assembly lines that once carried car bodies now bore the skeletons of tanks. The same hands that had crafted chrome and leather were now riveting armor plates and tightening bolts on steel beasts bound for Europe. There was no grandeur in this work. No banners, no speeches, no parades. Just motion. Relentless, mechanical, unstoppable motion. Each hour mattered. Each minute carried the weight of soldiers waiting on distant fronts. A single broken machine meant a delay in delivery. A delay meant lives at risk. And yet, even in exhaustion, the workers did not stop. They knew that victory was not only fought with rifles, but with rivets, gears, and gasoline. When German intelligence tried to trace the rhythm of this industrial miracle, they found nothing they could understand. The Reich's engineers, proud of their craftsmanship, believed in perfection, in the art of building the finest weapon, the strongest engine, the most advanced plane. But in America, perfection meant something else. It was not about building one perfect tank, it was about building thousands. A nation of mechanics had discovered a brutal kind of efficiency, not beauty, but abundance. Back in Berlin, Hitler's disbelief turned into irritation. He demanded to know whether the Americans truly had the materials for such production. His generals spoke of limitless resources: steel from Pennsylvania, rubber from Brazil, fuel from Texas. Every time he asked how, they gave him numbers so large they sounded like mockery. America, they said, was turning its entire continent into one enormous factory. At first, the Führer dismissed it as exaggeration, but late at night, surrounded by maps and figures, he began to see a pattern that disturbed him. Every month, new divisions arrived at the front wearing fresh uniforms, driving brand new vehicles, firing weapons that seemed to come from nowhere. Supplies that should have taken months to produce were replenished in weeks. And the name Ford appeared again and again in captured documents, stamped on engines, parts, and crates. That name began to haunt him. Ford, the same man he once admired for his industrial genius, whose book he had once read with fascination. Now, the American carmaker had become the architect of an enemy empire of machines. The truth was dawning. Germany could still fight, but it could not outbuild. The real war was not just in the skies or trenches, it was in the factories, the furnaces, and the endless heartbeat of Detroit. As the snow fell over Europe, the contrast between two worlds grew clearer. In the East, men froze in their trenches. In the West, the machines of democracy roared through the night. And somewhere between disbelief and dread, Hitler began to understand that he was no longer fighting armies. He was fighting an idea forged in steel, powered by oil, and built by a nation that refused to sleep. That realization, though unspoken, marked the beginning of a slow unraveling, for in that moment, the war of ideology began to yield to the war of production, and the world's greatest industrial engine had just begun to turn at full speed. It began long before the war, long before the world imagined tanks rolling from factory floors like toys on a conveyor belt. The seed was planted in the quiet hum of early 20th century Detroit, in the restless mind of a man who wanted to build something ordinary people could afford. Henry Ford wasn't thinking about weapons or battlefronts. He dreamed of mobility, of freedom on four wheels, but his dream would one day arm a continent. When Ford first sketched the idea of the moving assembly line, it was almost absurd. Factories in his time were slow, chaotic, and dependent on craftsmen who built each car piece by piece. Ford wanted rhythm instead of artistry, machines and humans moving in the perfect synchronization. Every step had a purpose, every movement a place. The Model T was born from this philosophy, not as a luxury, but as a revolution. The car for everyone, rolling out of the plant every 93 minutes. What Ford didn't know was that he had just rewritten the rules of creation itself. The concept of mass production spread like wildfire. Factories became living organisms, vast mechanical cities where the heartbeat of progress was measured not in time, but in output. Steel came in one end, and finished dreams rolled out the other. The American worker became part of a greater machine, one that ran on precision, repetition, and belief in endless improvement. By the late 1930s, the United States had perfected a new kind of miracle, the miracle of scale. So, when the world caught fire again, it wasn't just soldiers who answered the call. It was the machines. Ford's factories, along with General Motors, Chrysler, and countless smaller plants, turned overnight into the lifeblood of the coming war effort. The same lines that once fitted steering wheels now installed gun turrets. Engines for tractors became engines for bombers. Even the workers barely had time to process the transformation. One day they built sedans, the next they were forging the backbone of an army. What made this possible was Ford's quiet genius, the understanding that production itself could be a weapon. He believed that anything could be built faster, simpler, and cheaper if the process was broken into steps so small no single person could stop the rhythm. It was a philosophy that turned thousands of individuals into a single entity, an army of hands. And in war, that unity would prove more powerful than any doctrine. Across the ocean, German engineers admired Ford's methods in peacetime. Some even visited his plants in the 1920s. They took notes, studied the movement of belts and cranes, and returned home inspired but skeptical. They understood the brilliance, but not the culture behind it. Germany prized perfection, America prized progress. While one sought to build the flawless machine, the other built a million that worked well enough. And in war, enough could mean victory. As the first tanks and planes rolled out of American factories, there was something almost poetic in their creation. Each screw, each weld, each panel carried the fingerprints of ordinary people. Mechanics, mothers, farmers, and students who had traded their daily lives for the discipline of production. The dream of affordable cars had transformed into a promise of freedom on a global scale. In less than 2 decades, Ford's vision had evolved from mobility to might. The moving line, once a symbol of prosperity, had become a weapon of endurance. The same logic that put a Model T in every garage would now put a Sherman tank on every battlefield. The Industrial Revolution that began with a dreamer in Detroit had finally found its purpose, to build faster than destruction itself. And as the world braced for the coming storm, the machines that once carried families across America prepared to carry an entire nation to war. January 1941. The words drifted from every radio in America, steady, solemn, and filled with the weight of destiny. Franklin D. Roosevelt's voice cut through the static of the age. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a command that reached from Washington's marble halls to the smallest mechanic's shop in the Midwest. Overnight, it gave the nation a single identity, not of warriors, but of builders. Factories that once echoed with the sound of jazz and chatter now pulsed with the rhythm of machinery. Men who had spent their lives tightening bolts on car doors now assembled the armor plates of Sherman tanks. Women stepped into the lines with rolled sleeves and sparks in their eyes, learning to weld, rivet, and assemble engines larger than any car they had ever seen. The transformation was total. Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, cities once defined by consumer dreams, became fortresses of production, their skylines crowned not by advertisements, but by smoke and light. The change was almost mystical. America didn't just build for itself, it built for the world. The British, exhausted and desperate, needed planes. The Soviets, fighting for survival, needed trucks and fuel. Every shipment that crossed the Atlantic carried more than steel and oil. It carried faith that machines could turn the tide of history. Cargo ships left American ports loaded with tanks, jeeps, and aircraft engines. Thousands upon thousands, stamped with the words, "Made in USA." Within months, entire industries were reborn. The automobile plants that once rolled out Fords and Chevrolets became factories for bombers and troop carriers. The Ford Willow Run plant, designed to build the B-24 Liberator, became the largest factory under one roof on Earth. There, the impossible happened. A complete bomber leaving the line every hour. Workers spoke of the planes as if they were living things, born from fire and sweat, soaring from the assembly lines into the clouds of war. Everywhere, the air smelled of oil, rubber, and determination. Posters on factory walls urged speed and precision. Do the job he left behind. A message aimed at the husbands and sons now fighting overseas. The home front became a second battlefield, and its soldiers wore denim instead of uniforms. They worked by the thousands, shoulder to shoulder, as trains rattled past, carrying tanks west and bombers east. It was chaos with purpose, an orchestra of noise where every clang of metal was a note of defiance. And yet, beneath the thunder of progress, there was a strange calm, a sense that something greater than any individual was moving the nation forward. The idea of the arsenal of democracy wasn't about power, it was about duty. It meant that freedom itself had been industrialized. Every wrench turned in Detroit, every bullet pressed in Illinois, every engine tested in California. Each act was a declaration that America would never again wait for others to fight tyranny. Across the Atlantic, those watching couldn't comprehend it. German analysts tried to map the scale of it all, to count the factories, to predict the limits of American capacity. But there were none. Every time they thought they had reached the end, another plant came online, another 1,000 workers signed up, another miracle of logistics emerged from nowhere. It was as if the entire continent had awoken from its isolationist slumber, rising not with swords, but with engines, belts, and blueprints. By the end of the year, Roosevelt's words had transformed into steel reality. America was no longer preparing for war. It was fueling it. The nation had become a living machine, powered by belief and purpose. It was building not for conquest, but for endurance. For a world where freedom would be measured not in speeches, but in how fast a bomber could take flight. And as the first fleets of American-made tanks rolled off ships into foreign ports, even the soldiers who drove them felt it. Behind every wheel, behind every gun, stood an entire people who had turned industry into resistance. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a phrase. It was alive, and it was unstoppable. By mid-1943, German intelligence had begun to whisper the unthinkable. Reports arrived in sealed envelopes stamped Geheime Kommandosake, top secret, yet even the ink on the pages felt absurd. The numbers didn't make sense. One American plant, they claimed, was producing more tanks in a single week than an entire German province could in a month. The idea violated everything the Reich believed about war, discipline, and industry. Inside the tall, smoke-filled offices of the Abwehr, and later the RSHA, clerks sorted cables from agents scattered across North America. They described vast buildings stretching farther than the eye could see, glowing day and night with electric light. Conveyor belts carried engines, turrets, and armor plates in endless rhythm. German analysts stared at photographs that looked almost surreal. Workers standing shoulder to shoulder, lines of vehicles so long they vanished into haze. Someone muttered, "No nation can sustain this output," yet the shipments kept leaving American ports. Field officers sent word that every harbor on the U.S. coast was bursting with steel hulls and cranes. From New York to San Francisco, trains loaded with tanks thundered across the plains. Spy networks tried to measure the impossible. How many hours did these people work? How much fuel did they consume? Where did they find so much rubber and copper? The data refused to align with any known logic. The conclusion was both simple and terrifying. The Americans had outgrown scarcity. When the reports reached the Führer's headquarters in East Prussia, they were met with scorn. Hitler tossed one dossier aside, calling it an enemy trick designed to demoralize the Reich. 500 tanks a day? He sneered. Fairy tales for frightened generals. Around him, aides nodded dutifully, though many had already seen the photos. Aerial reconnaissance of massive complexes like Willow Run and River Rouge. They had watched as trainloads of bombers rolled straight from factory to runway. Still, no one dared contradict him. Behind closed doors, however, unease began to spread. Albert Speer's ministry demanded more resources, more workers, more miracle machines to close the gap. But the arithmetic was brutal. Germany built by hand, America built by system. Every new Allied offensive seemed to prove the reports true. Tanks lost on the front lines were replaced within days. Air raids that should have crippled production barely slowed it. Even under attack, the American factories kept running, drawing on an ocean of manpower and material that seemed infinite. German intelligence officers grew desperate. They sent agents to Mexico, Argentina, even neutral Switzerland, hoping to intercept trade routes and shipping manifests. What they found instead was scale beyond imagination. Thousands of subcontractors feeding the great machine, each one a small cog in a continental network. The Reich, for all its order, had no answer for such organized chaos. In the war rooms of Berlin, the reports piled higher. Every one of them told the same story. The Americans were producing war like they produced cars, endlessly, efficiently, mercilessly. And with each passing month, the numbers grew larger. Yet disbelief still lingered at the top. Hitler clung to the notion that quality would triumph over quantity, that the German spirit could outlast machinery. But those around him had begun to sense a quieter truth. That spirit could not stop an assembly line. By the time reality set in, it was already too late. The Reich spies had seen the future, a world where victory belonged not to the most disciplined, but to the most industrialized. And in that realization lay the first flicker of panic, a silent understanding that the war Germany thought it could win with genius and willpower was being buried beneath mountains of American steel. By early 1944, the truth could no longer be dismissed as propaganda. German reconnaissance flights returning from across the Atlantic brought back images that defied belief, not of cities, but of factories so vast they looked like entire towns made of metal and glass. One particular series of photos showed the Willow Run complex near Detroit, its roof stretching to the horizon, rail lines weaving in and out like veins feeding a living organism. Analysts counted the silhouettes of tanks, trucks, and bombers lined up outside, waiting for transport. When they finished the calculations, the room fell silent. The math was simple, the meaning devastating. America was producing war at a pace the world had never seen, 500 tanks a day. The phrase spread through the Reich's corridors like a curse. Officers whispered it in disbelief. Engineers argued that the steel supply alone would make such output impossible. Yet the numbers were confirmed again and again through intercepted communications and reports from occupied France. Entire divisions of newly built Shermans and half-tracks appeared at once, as if conjured from thin air. Each one bore fresh paint, perfect machinery, and the same cold, stamped precision, made in USA. At the front, German soldiers noticed it first. They destroyed an Allied tank column in the morning, only to face another by nightfall. Tanks that should have taken months to replace returned to battle in days. It was as though the Americans had found a way to manufacture time itself. Even the Luftwaffe's pilots, once proud hunters of Allied convoys, began to speak in awe of the endless flow of reinforcements arriving at every port and airfield. The psychological effect was enormous. For the first time, German intelligence reports contained words rarely used in official documents. Überlegenheit der Produktion, superiority of production. The very rhythm of war had changed. Battles were no longer decided by strategy or bravery, but by logistics, by how fast a country could rebuild what was lost. And in that contest, the United States had already won. Deep in his mountain headquarters, Hitler demanded explanations. He shouted at his ministers, accusing them of exaggeration, of spreading fear. Speer laid the numbers before him: ship manifests, factory records, photographic evidence. The Führer's face hardened. He refused to accept that any nation could create 500 armored vehicles a day, alongside thousands of planes and artillery pieces. "Then why are they not already in Berlin?" he snapped. No one answered. They all knew the answer. They were coming. Meanwhile, in America, the factories never slept. Night shifts replaced day shifts. The air vibrated with the clang of steel, the hiss of welding torches, the thunder of testing engines. Women with scarves tied around their hair worked side by side with veterans too old for the front. Each motion, practiced and automatic, the walls trembled with the pulse of production. Every minute mattered. Each completed tank meant a soldier's life saved, a battle line held. And when the tanks finally rolled out of the assembly halls, it was a sight to behold. Lines of steel giants crawling toward the open world, their armor gleaming under floodlights. They were not hand-built masterpieces like German Tigers. They were simpler, rougher, but endless. For every tank destroyed, 3 more were already on their way. The logic of war had been rewritten. Efficiency now outweighed elegance. For German intelligence, the revelation marked a turning point. The old belief in technical superiority crumbled beneath the weight of American speed. The Reich had entered a war of machines, and machines obeyed only one rule: the faster one wins. From that moment on, the war's outcome was no longer a matter of if, but when. The tide of steel was moving westward, carried by ships, trains, and determination. The world had witnessed the birth of something new, an era where factories, not armies, would decide the fate of nations. And in that relentless hum of engines, the future was already roaring. The war never slept, and neither did the people who built it. By the time America's industrial might reached its peak, the factories of Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh had become cities within cities, vast, breathing organisms of fire, noise, and emotion. Their veins carried molten steel, their lungs exhaled smoke, and their heartbeat was the rhythm of the assembly line. The front lines were oceans away, but inside those walls, another kind of battle raged. One fought not with rifles, but with endurance. When the men left for war, the women stayed and took their place. Housewives, teachers, and secretaries traded aprons for goggles, high heels for heavy boots. They stood beside the furnaces and presses, their hands steady, their backs aching, their faces streaked with oil. To many, it was the first time they had been told they were capable of more than home and kitchen. Now they were riveters, welders, and mechanics, the invisible army behind the soldiers. Posters on factory walls showed smiling women in blue uniforms with the slogan, "We can do it." It wasn't just a motto, it was a vow. Factories ran without pause, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When the daylight workers went home, the midnight crews took their place. The changeovers were seamless, like soldiers exchanging posts. Floodlights burned through the night, and the glow of the forges painted the sky in shades of orange and smoke. Trains arrived at dawn to collect the finished machines, their wheels screeching under the weight of engines, artillery, and armored hulls. Detroit's river froze in winter, but the furnaces never cooled. It was grueling work. The air inside the plants was thick with heat and metal dust. Machines thundered so loudly that workers learned to communicate with gestures and glances. Meals were eaten standing up, a sandwich in one hand, a wrench in the other. Sleep became a luxury, rest an afterthought, but there was pride in the exhaustion. Each completed tank or plane carried a signature of collective defiance. We made this, and it will reach them before they reach us. Teenagers lied about their age to join the effort. Retired mechanics came back, their hands trembling but precise. Immigrants who barely spoke English learned to follow the rhythm of production faster than words could teach. America had become a single body, millions of hands working toward one heartbeat. Every state contributed: steel from Pennsylvania, aluminum from Washington, engines from Michigan, cotton from the South. The entire map pulsed with the same relentless tempo. There was beauty amid the chaos. In the dim light of night shifts, faces glowed with sweat and determination. The clang of tools and the roar of furnaces became the soundtrack of a generation that understood sacrifice without ever seeing the battlefield. Letters from soldiers overseas often began with thanks not to generals, but to the folks back home who keep us rolling. And those words mattered. They reminded every factory worker that each rivet and screw carried someone's hope of coming home alive. In Chicago's steel mills, molten metal poured like rivers of sunlight. In Pittsburgh, hammers struck anvils in unending rhythm, echoing through the valleys. In Detroit, the air trembled under the weight of progress. The night sky above these cities glowed not with stars, but with the fire of creation, the fire of a people who had turned their will into machinery. By 1944, the numbers were staggering. Over 6 million women in war industries, factories operating around the clock, and production records broken week after week. But the real victory wasn't in the statistics. It was in the unity. Every worker, no matter who they were or where they came from, had become a part of something far larger. A living engine that could not be bombed, could not be silenced, could not be stopped. The war may have been decided on distant shores, but its soul was forged here, in the clang of steel, in the glow of midnight furnaces, and in the hands of people who believed that even from the depths of exhaustion, they could build something stronger than fear. By the summer of 1944, the once confident Reich had begun to gasp under the weight of its own promises. The reports from the front were grim. Entire tank divisions lost in weeks, factories reduced to rubble, supply lines strangled by Allied air raids. And still, the numbers from across the Atlantic grew. 500 tanks a day, 1,000 planes a week, ships sliding into the sea faster than they could be sunk. The idea that America's factories could replace in days what Germany took months to rebuild filled the Reich's war rooms with quiet dread. In that atmosphere of desperation, Hitler's obsession turned toward salvation through technology. He demanded Wunderwaffen, miracle weapons, machines so advanced they would reverse the course of the war overnight. Engineers and scientists were summoned to underground bunkers, mountain labs, and hidden facilities carved into the rock. There, under the flicker of oil lamps and the constant rumble of Allied bombers overhead, they sketched blueprints that bordered on madness: supersonic jets, rocket-powered interceptors, long-range missiles capable of reaching London from the continent. The V-2 rocket became the symbol of this desperate faith. It was magnificent, the first true ballistic missile, roaring into the sky faster than sound, carrying destruction from the clouds. But it was also tragically impractical. Each rocket consumed enormous resources and required precision manufacturing that Germany could no longer afford. For every V-2 launched, hundreds of Allied planes were being built in American factories, rolling out of hangars by the hour. The Reich's genius could no longer compete with America's scale. In Peenemünde, scientists worked night and day under the gaze of SS officers, while in Augsburg and Regensburg, engineers tried to finish the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was a marvel of speed and design, capable of outrunning anything in the skies. But fuel was scarce, materials even scarcer, and trained pilots scarcer still. What rolled out of those secret hangars were not squadrons, but handfuls of prototypes. By the time each miracle weapon reached the front, the Allied tide had already shifted, burying the Reich under an avalanche of steel and fire. Meanwhile, the bombers never stopped. Night after night, American B-17s and British Lancasters rained destruction over Germany's industrial heart. The once mighty factories of the Ruhr were now smoldering ruins. Workers slept in shelters instead of homes. Production lines were dismantled and moved into mountain tunnels and salt mines to escape the bombs. But hiding meant slowing down, and slowing down meant dying. Albert Speer, now Minister of Armaments, performed logistical miracles just to keep the machines turning. He reorganized supply chains, recycled scrap metal, and rationed every drop of oil. For a time, he succeeded in keeping the illusion of control. Factories still delivered, numbers still rose. But behind the statistics, reality was collapsing. The trains carrying weapons also carried refugees. The soldiers manning the assembly lines were no longer engineers, but forced laborers dragged from conquered lands, working under brutal conditions. Quality fell, morale crumbled, and precision, the pride of German engineering, began to vanish. Hitler refused to see it. In his mountain retreat, he raged at his ministers, demanding faster results, greater output, more rockets, more jets, more miracles. He clung to the idea that a single weapon could undo the ocean of production rising against him. But even the brightest minds of the Reich knew the truth. The war had turned into a contest of endurance, and Germany was out of breath. In the end, the Wunderwaffen became symbols not of power, but of desperation, glittering, extraordinary, and useless against the sheer arithmetic of American industry. While Germany built prototypes, America built armies. While the Reich dreamed of a miracle, Detroit delivered 500 new realities every day. And as the Allied bombers returned to the sky, lighting the night with the fire of collapsing cities, the engineers who once believed in Hitler's vision began to see what he never could, that even the greatest invention means nothing when buried beneath an enemy's endless supply. The war of ideas had become a war of production, and the side that built faster was already writing the future. The first rumble always came before dawn, a low vibration through the earth, a faint hum that seemed to grow inside the bones before reaching the ears. Then came the wail of sirens, a sound that every German city had come to dread. From Hamburg to Dresden, from the Ruhr to Berlin, millions would wake not to the rising sun, but to the shadow of bombers, thousands of them, glinting silver in the morning light. They filled the sky like a moving storm. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, products of the same Ford and Boeing assembly lines that had once built family cars and passenger planes, now flew in perfect formation, a synchronized ballet of destruction. Each carried tons of explosives and incendiary bombs, each born from the roaring factories of Detroit, Seattle, and California. And down below lay the beating heart of Germany's war machine, the foundries, refineries, and rail yards that had once powered its ambitions. The irony was merciless. The same industrial miracle Hitler had mocked, the idea of quantity over perfection, now hovered above him, turning his empire into ash. The sound of American engines drowned out church bells and air raid sirens alike. When the bombs fell, the world shook. Flames leapt skyward, painting the clouds red. Entire blocks vanished in seconds. Rail lines twisted like ribbon. Chimneys stood alone where factories once sprawled. In the Ruhr, workers emerged from shelters to find their machines buried in molten rubble. In Hamburg, the firestorm burned so hot that asphalt melted beneath fleeing feet. Dresden would follow, its Baroque skyline collapsing under the weight of Allied payloads. What the Luftwaffe had done to Warsaw and London now returned 100-fold. The Reich's industrial arteries were severed, one by one, until even the most devoted engineers realized that rebuilding was no longer possible. And yet, while Germany burned, America's output only grew. For every plane lost, another 10 rolled out of hangars the same week. New crews were trained, new engines tested, new assembly lines added. The factories that created the bombers were not slowing down under fire. They were speeding up. Their lights never dimmed, their belts never stopped. Across the ocean, the hum of production was now the soundtrack of inevitable victory. In Berlin, the contrast was unbearable. Speer's reports described entire industrial zones wiped off the map, synthetic fuel plants destroyed, railway hubs gone, steel production cut in half. Even as he delivered the numbers, he watched Hitler dismiss them with a wave of the hand, retreating deeper into fantasy. "We will rebuild," he said. "We have the will." But the will could no longer feed the furnaces, and the furnaces could no longer feed the war. The skies above Europe had become the new battlefield. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, could barely rise to meet the endless waves of bombers. For every German fighter destroyed, another squadron of American planes appeared on the horizon. The imbalance was not just visible, it was deafening. Pilots described looking up and seeing nothing but wings and sunlight reflected off polished aluminum. The air itself had been conquered. Below, the German people lived in twilight. Nights glowed orange with firestorms. Mornings smelled of smoke and dust. Children learned to read by candlelight in shelters. Mothers carried water to cool the ruins of their streets. And still, the reign of steel continued, precise, methodical, unstoppable. Across the Atlantic, newspapers called it the price of tyranny. In the factories, workers whispered that each bolt they tightened was one step closer to peace. The people who built those bombers would never see the cities they destroyed, but they understood the message written in every mission, that the power of industry, once unleashed, could not be undone. By late 1944, Germany's industrial heart was gone. Production had fallen to a fraction of its former strength. Fuel was scarce, transportation paralyzed. But in America, the tempo only intensified. The assembly lines sang louder than ever, echoing across a continent untouched by war. And so, the final irony became complete. The factories Hitler had dismissed as symbols of weakness had become engines of retribution. The sky itself had turned into America's assembly line, dropping not cars or tools, but fire, a storm built by the hands of workers who had never seen the battlefield, yet helped to end it. By the spring of 1945, the war that once seemed destined to crown the Reich in glory had shrunk to the dim echo of footsteps inside a concrete bunker beneath Berlin. The walls trembled with every distant explosion. Dust fell from the ceiling with each artillery strike, and maps spread across the table no longer showed advances, but encirclements. Hitler paced in silence, his eyes hollow, his voice hoarse from disbelief. Each new report sounded like an insult. American vehicles in France, American convoys in Italy, American tanks in the very heart of Germany. Everywhere he looked, the same truth loomed. The Americans had built more than anyone thought possible, and now their machines were closing in. The reports arrived in stacks, their paper edges still warm from the printers. Speer brought figures showing columns of Allied armor moving through shattered towns, faster than any German unit could retreat. Entire divisions were gone, supply depots captured, bridges seized, fuel reserves exhausted. Hitler's rage came in bursts, shouting that his generals were liars, that the numbers were false, that miracles would still come. But even his closest aides no longer believed. They could hear the engines above ground, the deep rhythmic growl of tanks, the thunder of bombers, the mechanical heartbeat of a world he no longer understood. The myth of German superiority, of precision and willpower overcoming numbers, lay in ruins. For years, the Reich had trusted in its engineering, its discipline, its faith in the perfect machine. But the Americans had built something more powerful than perfection. They had built abundance. Every time a Tiger tank was lost, the Allies answered with a dozen Shermans. Every plane shot down was replaced by another before the wreckage even cooled. The Germans had been fighting against time itself, and time, manufactured in America's endless factories, had finally won. In the bunker, Hitler refused to look at the photos that Speer laid before him. Endless lines of American vehicles stretching across French roads, aircraft filling runways from horizon to horizon, ports choked with landing craft. "Where are they getting all this?" he asked once, almost whispering. No one answered. Everyone knew. The names were stamped on every crate and engine block: Ford, Chrysler, General Motors. The same companies he had dismissed as symbols of weakness had built an army so vast that even the oceans could not contain it. The generals spoke quietly among themselves. They knew what Hitler would not admit, that the war was lost not in the trenches or the skies, but in the factories and shipyards of a distant continent that had never stopped building. The soldiers at the front were not just facing men. They were facing production itself, an enemy that could not be bombed, could not be starved, could not be outlasted. The Reich's fate had been sealed the moment it underestimated the power of an idea, that machines, multiplied endlessly, could crush ideology itself. Above the ground, Berlin was dying. The air was thick with smoke and dust. Buildings split open like broken teeth, and the streets were filled with the wreckage of vehicles that had once been symbols of pride. Yet even in this chaos, the sound that haunted the defenders most was mechanical. The steady rumble of Allied engines drawing closer, the clatter of tank treads echoing through the ruins. Inside the bunker, the rage faded into silence. Hitler sat surrounded by maps that no longer meant anything, listening to the muffled world collapsing around him. His faith, in destiny, in will, in the superiority of German genius, had dissolved under the sheer arithmetic of American steel. The same industrial rhythm he once mocked had become the pulse of his defeat. The war had revealed its final truth. The future belonged not to those who inspired fear, but to those who could outbuild it. And above the ruins of the Reich, that truth roared on, in the engines of American tanks, in the wings of their bombers, and in the endless hum of factories an ocean away that never stopped turning, even as the world they conquered fell silent. When the guns finally fell silent, the world seemed to exhale for the first time in years. The rumble of war faded, but another sound lingered, the faint mechanical echo of engines, conveyors, and furnaces that had carried civilization through its darkest storm. The assembly lines that had once built bombers and tanks began to slow, the lights dimming over factory floors where entire armies had been forged from steel and sweat. Peace had returned, but it was clear that the world which emerged was no longer the one that had gone to war. Across America, the same workers who had built the arsenal of democracy returned to their homes, some to farms, some to schools, others back to the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. The women who had held the tools of war now cradled children or typed letters in offices. Yet the pride of what they had done never left them. They had built something more enduring than weapons. They had built belief in unity, in purpose, in what human hands could achieve when guided by necessity and faith. At Ford's River Rouge plant, the furnaces that once spat sparks into the Michigan night cooled at last. But even in silence, the place felt alive, a cathedral of metal and memory. The catwalks, cranes, and massive presses stood like monuments to an age when the line between factory and battlefield had disappeared. Those who walked its floors after the war spoke of an invisible presence, the ghosts of a nation's will, still humming in the steel. The statistics alone told the story of victory. 300,000 planes, 100,000 tanks, millions of trucks, rifles, and shells. But the numbers were only symbols of something deeper. America had not simply built machines, it had built time, the ability to recover faster, strike harder, and endure longer than any enemy. The war had become a contest of capacity, and no ideology could compete with the rhythm of mass production. The nation that could outbuild would always outlast. In Europe, ruins stretched from the Channel to the Volga, and the once mighty Reich lay in ashes. The cities that had once mocked America's soulless factories were now learning from them. The same principles that had defeated the Axis, standardization, organization, endless repetition, became the foundation of a new world. Highways, airplanes, and consumer goods spread across continents, all born from the wartime blueprint of efficiency. The line between military and civilian innovation blurred forever. And yet, there was a quiet melancholy to it. The war had proven what humanity could achieve when forced to the edge. But it also revealed how fragile that balance was. The same machines that built freedom could one day build fear again. The same factories that had saved the world could, in another age, endanger it. Still, for now, they stood as symbols of resilience. Henry Ford's dream, once about mobility and progress, had evolved into something far greater. His moving assembly line, once dismissed as mechanical and impersonal, had become the backbone of a civilization capable of defending itself through sheer creation. The factory was no longer just a place of labor. It was a fortress, a weapon, a heart that could beat faster than destruction itself. In the quiet after victory, as nations rebuilt and scars healed, one truth became impossible to ignore. Wars would never again be won by courage alone. The soldier with a rifle mattered, but behind him stood 1,000 unseen builders, hammering, welding, assembling the fate of nations. The 20th century had crowned a new kind of power. Not the empire of kings, not the tyranny of ideology, but the dominion of industry. And so, beneath the fading hum of America's great factories, the lesson of that war endured, that the greatest weapon of all was not the bomb or the gun, but the will to build faster, longer, and stronger than those who sought to destroy. The machine had not only won the war, it had defined the age,